for that. Gail never thought that she would marry a minister. Now, when she met me, I told her I planned to study religion. But I also was a punk rock dulcimer player, and she didn't know which career was going to take. In a sense, music has always been a part of my life. And it's been a part of my ministry. One of my earliest memories was my mom taking me to Detroit to see the Beatles in concert when I was 6. And the Beatles broke up in 1970, and I became a huge Billy Preston fan. He was an African-American keyboard player who played on the Let It Be album. And George Harrison actually produced his first 2 albums. In fact, he sang My Sweet Lord. He released it before George Harrison did. And he introduced me to gospel and funk music. I was the only kid in my all-white northern Michigan town who was listening to gospel music. And he was the first musical guest on Saturday Night Live back in 1975. And he sang, "Nothing from nothing leaves nothing. I'm not stuffing, believe you me. Don't you remember I told you I'm a soldier in the war on poverty?" He was rebellious, yet optimistic, and so was I. He was just a perfect person for my middle school years. But in the spring of 1976, my mom died. And to make matters worse, funk kind of faded and morphed into disco, which was so depressing and made everything seem meaningless. And then in 1977, Elvis Costello appeared on Saturday Night Live. He started one song, and they said, "I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, there's no reason for us to play this song here." And he turned around and yelled, "Radio, radio," and the band went into a totally different song. Got him banned from Saturday Night Live for at least 10 years. And the song had these words that said, "Some of my friends sit around every evening and they worry about the times ahead. But everyone is overwhelmed by indifference and the promise of an early bed. You either shut up or get cut out. I don't want to hear about it. Every inch is on the reel to reel, and radio is in the hands of such a lot of fools trying to anesthetize the way that you feel." Boy, that sang to me. That spoke to the rage I was feeling. The world was unfair, and I wanted to shout and wake people up. The rabble needed rousing. I went to college to study psychology, and I went to grad school to study ministry and social work. I wanted to change the world, but I also needed to get a job. So here I am, ready to be a minister. It's the 90s, and yes, I am wearing a mullet haircut. Business up front, a party in the back. But as you can see, I draped my party over my shoulder just as a warning to the unaware. My ordination was in 1995. I was famous. My name was on a sign in downtown Kenosha. Little did I know that 25 years later, the sign would become more famous than me. It was set on fire during the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. Racial justice has been a big part of my ministry. In 1992, 2 months after my son's birth, the LA police were acquitted of beating Rodney King. I had a 2-month-old baby, and I realized that he was a threat, and people were going to be threatened by him, even when he was just tiny. Now that he's 6'2" and 250, he really scares people. I was at a Unitarian Universalist ministers meeting, and I was just overwhelmed with emotion, and I felt the support of my colleagues. I was just an intern minister in Racine, Wisconsin, and my mentor was Tony Larson. Tony Larson was a character. He showed me how to sing while struggling for justice. He taught me to keep my sense of humor even when talking about serious things. When I was preparing to do my first memorial service, he smiled at me and said, "Remember, funerals begin with fun." He reminded me of the absurdity of professional ministry. How is a flawed person with all these idiosyncrasies ever supposed to lead? One can only be one's best self, encouraging others to be their best selves. It takes a lot of forgiveness and a lot of grace for both the minister and the congregations. But often it works, and when it does, it is a miracle. So I came to the day in 1995. I was ordained, and I was joined by family and friends. Gail was wearing the same outfit that she was wearing today. I still have the stole from the day that I was there. My sister made it. I asked her to make it. I designed it, and I said I want it to be my billboard stole. Christians will wear a cross, and you can see where they were. And I remember we attended protests trying to protect people going into the abortion clinic, and so we had a thing where 4 Unitarian Universalist ministers showed up in Roman collars. And one of them, Tony, went to the other side of the line and held out a pro-choice sign standing in the midst of the anti-abortion group. And the headline said, "Man pretending to be a minister." And I said, I want people to know that I'm a Unitarian Universalist minister, and so I had my sister build this stole. Gail's dress was given to her by her sister to celebrate her African heritage. The specifics of Gail's heritage were unknown at that time. But through the miracle of DNA, she has learned that she is descended from the Yoruba people in the present-day Nigeria. She is even Facebook friends with a Nigerian cousin who lives in London. My first act as a UU minister was to give to the next generation. Here I am with my daughter Keziah and my grandson Jonathan, dedicating him. As a white male in a racist society, my family has been a constant reminder of the work that needs to be done. I'm so glad that even as I'm leaving the ministry, the UUA is considering voting on Article 2 to make racial justice and anti-oppression work central to our faith. My first congregation was the Sugarloaf Congregation of Unitarian Universalists in Maryland. This was a New Start congregation in northern Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C. Here I am with Muriel Davies. who was the first member to sign the charter. Muriel's husband, A. Powell Davies, was the minister of All Souls Church in Washington, D.C. in the 50s. And he was one of the first to speak out against McCarthyism and in support of civil rights. And he was so popular that he started churches in Rockville and 2 in Bethesda and 1 in Silver Spring. And the technology of the day was that they would gather in a room and there would be a radio speaker that the people would look at and worship as A. Powell spoke from his church down in D.C. We named the congregation Sugarloaf. And we had that discussion. This is the only church that I ever had a piece of naming. This was a New Start congregation, and so we had that whole conversation. Is this a church? Is this a society? Is it a fellowship? And we decided on congregation because it was the most neutral. And then we decided on Sugarloaf because, well, we were in Germantown in an elementary school, but we wanted to buy land somewhere. It could have been anywhere from Damascus to Gaithersburg. We had no idea where we were going to end up. But there was this mountain called Sugarloaf that was a stray mountain about 20 miles south of the Appalachians, and you could see it from all over Montgomery County. And I said, well, wherever we are, we'll be near Sugarloaf. And so that became our name, Sugarloaf Congregation. And this congregation started with 35 charter members, and then and had 70 members by the time I left in 2000. I then landed at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Winston-Salem. The building was a Frank Lloyd Wright-inspired sanctuary and fellowship hall and RE wing, and it was nestled off the main road on 5 acres of land. You came down a little driveway, and then the church was there. And this spoke to my transcendentalist heart, and these people had a real sense of the sacred place of space. And beside the pulpit were 2 big windows, and in February you could see Pilot Mountain in one of the windows. And so I never knew if the people were in rapt attention of me or the view when I was in that congregation. And Pilot Mountain is a stray mountain that's about 20 miles south of the Appalachian chain. And this congregation had a real sense of sacred space, even more so than me. I grew up in the Reformed tradition, and the church should see a box, and all this ornamentation is beside the point. We should just be focused on the matters at hand, But they really made their sanctuary very beautiful, and they made their grounds very beautiful. And they had eventually built a winding path down to the back of their property where there was a ravine, and there were stones where we would spread ashes. And it's just a beautiful, holy place. It just feels so wonderful. In the midst of this holy place is one of the most sad and hilarious moments of my ministry. I was doing a memorial for a woman who had been a tireless advocate for children who had been abused. She had been abused as a child, and she became a warrior, channeling her rage to create government and nonprofit programs in the county. Yet she had her own demons, and basically this rage also resulted in her drinking herself to death, and probably at the age of 55. And as you do in services, we come and we talk. And most of the eulogies for her were saying, Lisa was not an easy person to be around, but they all just admired her courage to keep going and to fight, and her tenacity in the face of evil. And after the service, we walked down the trail to the back of the property, and I was about to spread her ashes. And a woman from the congregation had made a ceramic pot so that instead of just a little square box, it was just this beautiful tray. And I'm standing and on these rocks, and I start to pour, and the ashes just pouring beautifully out of there, and the wind comes and covers me and everyone gathered. And we were so sad until someone said, "There's Lisa Sally in your face." There are moments. On a happier note, the first 3 Earth Day celebrations in Forsyth County were on the grounds of the Unitarian Universalist Church. And the event became so popular that it's now held on the county fairgrounds. We were a happy bunch of hippies. When we joined the church softball league, we didn't have a shirt made. And so we said, let's just wear something all the same color. And we talked, and we said, well, nobody had a shirt of the same color until someone said, how about tie-dye? And all of us had a tie-dye t-shirt. And eventually we bought ones from the UUA bookstore with the chalice on the front, and on the back we added the name of the church and the website and a slogan describing Unitarian Universalism as one love for all. In addition to softball games, we wore them at peace rallies and other community events, just often as this congregation wears their bright yellow shirts, which need updating. That's a path for this next thing, to get new shirts so people know who we are, because you won't have somebody walking around with a billboard. Because most other ministers that you will get will have better taste than me. In my time in Winston-Salem, the congregation grew from 200 to 300 members, and I learned how to be more of an administrator, and I also learned that I didn't like being an administrator. And I wanted to work with smaller congregations that was more personal. So I entered the search process. And before we left, Gail and I recorded our first CD entitled One Love for All. And we sold it as a church fundraiser at our going away party. We ended up in Lafayette, Indiana. And I was glad to be away from the Carolina heat. I actually enjoy winter. Gail was happy I did not go to other churches I looked at in Michigan and Calgary. In Lafayette, our music ministry really took off. This picture shows us leading the worship service at Purdue University for Bishop Gene Robinson. He had been the first openly gay bishop in the Episcopal Church, and he came to share the gospel of inclusiveness. And in Lafayette and West Lafayette, we met a community of professional musicians within the church and beyond the walls. And they can be heard on 3 of our CDs, Glad, Decalogue, and Scared. And we recorded these albums, and I made a curriculum to go with them. And they were source material for sermons and adult education and things that I have preached and sang here. And during this time, we also recorded a CD with my brother-in-law in Oregon. It was called Skin, which was about racial and gender justice. But back to the work of ministry. One of the things I had to do with the congregation in Indiana had to do with self-identity. They formed under the name UU Church of Lafayette, but had moved across the river to West Lafayette. And so some of their official documents said UU Church of West Lafayette. And then some of them had the clumsy title UU Church of Greater Lafayette, as if to show disrespect to those lesser Lafayettes like in Louisiana. And so having a sense of marketing, we can't market a church when we don't know the name of it. And so we settled on the UU Church of Tippecanoe County, which Tippecanoe locates us because there were many Lafayettes, and the Battle of Tippecanoe was an important battle. It began the War of 1812. It was kind of where Native Americans took one of their last stands. And so it is important to the history of the area. And as the choir noted earlier, I do like history. I thoroughly enjoyed interfaith work with the UU Church of Tippecanoe. Because of the global reach of Purdue University, the diversity included Christians, Jews, Muslims, Baha'is, and Hindus. There's a picture of us commemorating the 10th anniversary of 9/11. We also held study groups and shared international dinners. And this gave us power to speak on issues such as immigration. And UUs led the charge on issues like Black Lives Matter. And we held discussions, events included local police and politicians from both parties. The Republican mayor of West Lafayette was able to pass anti-discrimination laws for LGBTQ community. And sometimes our protests took surprising turns. We had successfully thwarted Indiana Governor Mike Pence's attempt to ban gay marriage. But the Tippecanoe County Clerk was still refusing to issue licenses. So a group of us went to the courthouse to protest. And in the middle of the protest, an announcement came that they would issue licenses. And so I married 5 couples that morning. We were at the courthouse, they were issuing licenses, and I had my robe on. What else could we do? For me, this is one of the best days of ministry. I mean, so often we preach and we protest for justice, but seldom are the results so quick. So often I have felt like a voice crying in the wilderness, and it's nice to see that love wins sometimes. I've tried to represent UU values in the community, and I'm grateful for all the UUs who have joined me in the struggle. But it has been a struggle. And in Tippecanoe, I began to feel burnt out. And at the end of 8 years, it was time to move on. And I wandered in the wilderness for a while, and then I found New Bern. This is a congregation that understands the meaning of community. The friendships here are strong. You care for each other when you're down, and you share the wealth. Fundraising and pledge drives here are surprisingly low-key. And I think this is because the bond you share in friendship. Most typically, my congregations, large and small, have had, well, they always come up with a theme for the pledge drive, but I think the theme always was the annual panic. People got whipped into a frenzy of doom and gloom. People were anxious that the church would fail, and nobody wanted to make pledge calls, and nobody wanted to take a pledge call because they were all scared to talk about money. Money in many UU churches is a boogeyman like Voldemort. Somehow you have to deal with it, but you can't mention the name. And in all these churches, amidst all the panic, when the pledge drive was over, it turned out it wasn't so dire after all. And almost every year there was an increase, and they were all surprised. And I kind of sat back and said, yeah, this happens every year. It's been said that UUs can talk about sex, religion, and politics, but get very shy when talking about Monday. But here in New Bern, it's been kind of matter of fact. Like someone says, oh, we should probably build something, or we should probably pay our bills. And most people agree. And I'm sure the finance committee has their concerns, and I've sat in some of these meetings about obstacles, but I've also seen them get into a rhythm like a hurdler and says, yeah, there's these things to deal with, and we'll just hurdle them. It's been one of the most remarkable things. And in COVID, when so many churches were just on the brink of failure, you managed to hold together monetarily. But I think it's because you hold together as friends. I arrived here in the wake of a hurricane, and I was impressed by how this congregation cared for each other and the community. After a year, we had expanded our sanctuary and religious education space, and over 100 visitors came to our open house. And it was published, publicity from that event was published in the paper on March 15th, 2020. And the state was shut down 3 days later. But it did not shut down this congregation. Craven neighbors, groups were created so people could keep the communication going. We could not keep in touch because touching was forbidden. But we took our lawn chairs and sat them 6 feet apart from each other and wore masks. And sometimes there was a question to bring focus to the conversation, but most of the time that question kind of just fell to the wayside as people just were genuinely concerned about how each other were doing. We even signed up a new member during this period when other churches were hemorrhaging members. And because we knew each other so well and had had the conversations, we knew that most of our people were vaccinated to a high enough percentage that we were able to reopen earlier than most other churches. And we learned to work with technology. This is the one thing that I am so grateful to COVID for. I didn't have to have a conversation and go to the board and say, hi, board. Wouldn't you think it'd be a great idea to spend thousands of dollars to reach out to people who might be out there? That would have been a long series of board meetings. But because this community cared about each other, they rose up and did what was necessary in the moment. I'm so proud of you. This community continues to reach out to the wider community. Hanging out in those parks during quarantine made us realize that these parks could be a little cleaner. And we adopted Leander Morgan Park, which is along the waterfront and in a minority neighborhood. And we also feed the hungry at religious community services. We have participated in Juneteenth and the Black History Parade. We have worked with Faith Connections to participate in the crop walks. And we've been part of street protests for civil rights, women's rights, and we danced at the first LGBTQ plus prom. Throughout all of this, I gave sermons. And that's one of the big illusions of becoming a minister, is that you kind of get this idea that I am going to study the great ideas and then present them each week. And then you become a minister of the church and you find yourself running around doing so many things that have nothing to do with sermons, but everything to do with the life of the people in the community. But nonetheless, I wrote these sermons, and I tried to inspire people to clarify their values and put them into action. And as I say farewell to the professional ministry and go into retirement, I am grateful for the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of New Bern. My goodness, 4 years and I still say that wrong. It's New Bern, not New Bern. But I came here on the heels of a hurricane, persevered through pestilence, trudged through trash, and I'm leaving in the wake of a wildfire. And only a community as loving as this could have made that a good time. I am confident of your future and have been glad to be part of your history. May we bless and be blessed.